Oppenheimer may just be one of the most critically acclaimed movies of the 2020s, and what only makes such a monumental achievement of filmmaking even more impressive is that there were so many different ways the film could have gone wrong, chief among them being the depiction of the main character himself, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Because as a writer myself, I can safely say that he's not a conventional lead by any means, but through a combination of Cillian Murphy's performance and Christopher Nolan's genius writing, they took what could have easily been the weakest part of the film and instead made him perhaps the most fascinating thing in it. And today, I'd like to take a look at J. Robert Oppenheimer's characterization and specifically why it was the perfect way to convey him for the story being told. And as always, there will be spoilers ahead, so in case you haven't seen Oppenheimer yet and don't want to know what happens, you should probably click off the video. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so as I already explained in my video on historically accurate movies, which you can find a link in the description to, Christopher Nolan's chief goal with Oppenheimer was to be as true to life as possible, which is a very strenuous task for any filmmaker to undergo for several different reasons. But one of the biggest, though overlooked, problems with that would have to be how to present the main character, because simply put, this man may have been a genius whose goal is generally accepted to have been to end World War II as quickly as possible, but he was also the man who brought the atomic bomb to life, cheated on his wife, and as Louis Stratus points out, never publicly expressed regret for the devastating fallout that his invention caused. Now, usually in cases like this, writers will either downplay the real-life individual's flaws and focus on their better qualities in order to make them more sympathetic to the viewer, or go all the way in the other direction and outright vilify them so the audience can root against them. But as I just noted, in truth, Oppenheimer wasn't either of those extremes, and Christopher Nolan insisted on depicting events as they actually happened. So how did he deal with the fact that his main character was a deeply flawed individual, while also making sure that the audience didn't lose sympathy for him? And the simple answer is, he presents him as he was, warts and all, and doesn't place any moral judgment on him one way or the other, similar to what he did in The Prestige, which I got more into in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, and lets the audience draw their own conclusions on how to feel about him, because the audience hates being told one thing about a character when their actions don't back it up, and even sometimes will be compelled to feel the opposite of the way the character is presented just for the sake of it, as I spoke about at length in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to. So Nolan doesn't try to say anything about him either way, and instead just presents the facts, making the audience more likely to empathize with him because they aren't being told that they should. But unlike The Prestige, Nolan doesn't abandon morality altogether and instead gently pushes the viewer towards feeling sympathetic to him in spite of his flaws, as he goes out of his way to depict him as a human being who ultimately wants to do the right thing, but has a hard time considering the consequences of his actions until after they've already happened. But again, all of this is very subtly done, especially because he doesn't shy away from his more questionable actions either. To put it another way, unlike most conventional movies, Oppenheimer doesn't tell the viewer outright that they should or shouldn't sympathize with the main character because it presents him at his best and worst while imposing no moral judgment upon him. Other characters might judge the morality of his actions, yes, but the narrative itself stays completely neutral. And the same honestly applies to all the other major characters in the film too, as not a single one is placed definitively in the right or wrong, and are simply depicted as they were in life for bad and good. So everybody is more or less as flawed as he is, so his more questionable actions don't really stand out as much as they otherwise would. Now, as I pointed out in the aforementioned video, depicting characters with such realistic flaws in and of itself can be a problem when trying to get the audience to sympathize with them. But as I just pointed out, the fact that the narrative never condemns or condones anyone for their actions and just presents them as is keeps the viewer from being too harsh because they aren't being told how they should feel. Though, as I noted before, the fact that Oppenheimer is presented as a person of morals in spite of his flaws does make one more compelled to sympathize with him, because even though he does some not so great things, he's never portrayed as malicious or having ill intent behind his actions. Again, the best way to describe Christopher Nolan's interpretation of J. Robert Oppenheimer is a man who doesn't think about what the fallout of his decisions will be until after the fact. And only a couple of examples include having an affair with Kitty, which gets her pregnant, resulting in him having to marry her, having another affair with Jean, leading to her death when her depression becomes unbearable and causes both him and his wife emotional distress, and, of course, pushing for the atomic bomb to be built and dropped to end the war, only for him to rethink the value of nuclear weapons once it's been done. To put it simply, Oppenheimer is a very flawed individual, yes, but Christopher Nolan does try to subtly portray him as a good man who simply isn't a forward thinker, which is what causes most of his problems. And what only reinforces this is that Nolan does also frame some of his more ambiguous deeds in a slightly more positive light in the film. Like as I already mentioned, Stratus points out that Oppenheimer never publicly said that the United States shouldn't have dropped the bomb on Japan, even after becoming a vocal supporter of nuclear disarmament, and uses this to argue that he's a hypocrite. And once again, that is completely true, so it's left up to the viewer to decide if Stratus is right for saying that. However, between his vision of the dead Japanese civilians after he hears that the bomb's been dropped, and how haunted he looks when talking with President Truman, Nolan does encourage the idea that he did feel guilty about what happened, but didn't want to publicly denounce what he and countless others dedicated years of their lives to working on. But very importantly, the narrative never outright says that this is the case and only implies that was how he felt, which still allows the viewer to draw whatever conclusion they want to. Which leads right into quite possibly the smartest decision Nolan made regarding the character. That J. Robert Oppenheimer is also presented as a man that's impossible to fully understand. He's a genius that lives in two realms at once, the real world and the world of atoms, and as a result functions completely differently than most people. And the way he's portrayed as almost insane at the beginning of the film, only for his more human side to slowly be exposed as the film goes on, makes him particularly fascinating, because even by the end when he's depicted at his most normal, it's still really difficult to get a handle on what he's really all about. He almost comes across as a man just sleepwalking through life half the time and only has brief moments of clarity. But it's obvious that isn't actually the case and that he knows what he's doing. He just has a very odd way of expressing himself. And this ambiguity regarding how exactly he functions also helps keep the audience from judging him so harshly, as they can't discern exactly what goes on in that head of his to the point that he can even come across as mentally ill, though the narrative stops short of implying that and leaves it up to the viewer whether he's just an eccentric genius or if his intellect comes with a price. To put it simply, J. Robert Oppenheimer's depiction in Oppenheimer might be one of the best examples of a flawed main character done right, as the audience is still made to sympathize with him despite the fact that it doesn't gloss over his issues or try to condone his more questionable actions, mainly because the narrative does depict everybody else of importance more or less the same way, tries to subtly imply that he is a good person despite his faults, and frames his mental state in such an ambiguous light that the viewer is more likely to want to dissect him than judge him. Though what also helps is that he's made out to be very human in spite of his intellect, and his mistakes are very comparable to ones that normal people could just as easily make, at least most of them, further lending him sympathy, as one thing he's never presented as is somebody with malicious intent, making his guilt when his actions inevitably cause suffering very pitiable. In other words, instead of portraying him as definitively right or wrong, the movie just presents him as he was, a human being. A particularly gifted and strange one, yes, but a human being nonetheless. And for a film that was trying to be as true to life as possible, there really was no better way to depict him than that. Okay, that's everything I had to say on that. So now give me your thoughts on this. Do you believe that J. Robert Oppenheimer's portrayal in 2023's Oppenheimer was the best way to present an extremely flawed character to the audience while making sure that they still sympathize with him? Or do you believe that there are better examples of that out there? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below, because you don't have to agree with any of the more opinion-based parts of this video if you don't want to. You can feel about both Oppenheimer and its main character however you want to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all very appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.